Tonight, crumbling schools, councils going bust, and an economy that is flat as a pancake. Who's to blame and who can fix it? We'll have exclusive polling and an exclusive interview. Andy Haldane, one of the country's top economic brains who advises the government, tells me it's down to decades of underinvestment and a Bank of England that printed money for too long. He should know, he used to work there. A green light to a greener energy future. Backbench rebels force the government to abandon the ban on onshore wind farms. But will it help bring down energy prices? And we bring you Florrie's story. She's learning online after suffering a school experience she called a literal hellhole. We hear from her, but ask, who should foot the bill for her education? And the long arm of the law. Do you recognise this prominent public figure? And where does this portrait rank in the list of the worst crimes against art? All of that and more with our panel, the broadcaster Nick Ferrari and Labour MP Dawn Butler, here to give their take for the next hour. It's Tuesday, I'm Sophy Ridge, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening, and welcome to the second ever Politics Hub, an hour of political news, interviews and debate. Now, I'm not sure there will ever be a better real-life example of failing to fix the roof when the sun was shining than classroom ceilings literally falling down. A risk to life known about for years but not fixed. And sometimes it seems to me that we need something like this, a classroom ceiling collapsing, to make us all wake up to what's going on with our economy. Because it does feel like Britain's infrastructure is crumbling. Schools, hospitals, roads, railways. And it's not something that's happened in the last few months or even years, although recent turbulence probably didn't help. This is something that has happened because of years and years of underinvestment and a sticking plaster approach. Capital spending, money spent on physical assets like school buildings or railway lines, doesn't sound sexy. I admit it. That's probably why it keeps getting cut. But this is the result, a country with a crumbling infrastructure and flatlining growth. Who's to blame? Most importantly, how can we fix it and who will pay? On tonight's Politics Hub, we're not shying away from the big questions. We can start with that specific crisis of the failing concrete in schools. Our Deputy Political Editor Sam Coates has been discovering why it's just the tip of the iceberg and it could end up costing an enormous amount of money to fix.
Fixing the roof while the sun is shining. Once a Tory pledge, now here an urgent mission. At this school in Luton, the costs of the concrete crisis are inescapable.
Well, it's devastating. The start of the school year should be everybody coming back, celebrating the results in summer, looking forward, setting the year ahead. And of course, now we're scrabbling around to re-timetable, to find temporary accommodation.
Ministers might feel they're doing a good job. Staff here, less sure.
We've been promised by Gillian Keegan that the DfE have secured some porta cabins, temporary classrooms, and they are available for immediate delivery. We've been asking when that might be, how many we might be able to have. We have no answer yet on that.
All eyes on the Education Secretary.
Is this government failing children, Minister?
Absolutely not.
But where does blame really lie? There is a fund to rebuild schools in need. Education ministers wanted a lot more money than they got from the man now running the country.
We put in a bid for 200, but what Rishi agreed to was to continue the rebuilding programme at 50 a year, consistent with what we've been doing.
50 a year, the limited promise, but the outcome even worse. Only 4 schools have been rebuilt since 2021. And Sky News understands this crisis could spiral.
What's frightening some in Whitehall is that they just don't know the scale of the problem beyond schools. Embattled Education Secretary Gillian Keegan took the most cautious of options when it came to concrete and schools because they're a unique case and there are children involved. But this has angered others in Whitehall who think that if the same standards are applied to other public buildings, the prison estate, local government buildings, military, then the disruption could be huge and the costs massive.
How to fix crumbling public buildings, now the subject of a Westminster blame game. The political cost already big, the financial cost could yet be even higher.
Well, as Sam was just saying, crumbling schools is a specific example of a problem that goes far wider, arguably beyond the responsibility of any single person or government. Some believe that it's unelected officials in the Bank of England who also bear some responsibility for the challenges facing the UK economy. Now, Andy Haldane knows a lot about both of those. He was the bank's chief advisor. He also advises the government. And when he speaks, people listen. So let's hear from him. Thank you very much for coming to talk to me. It's great to have you on the new programme. I want to start off with mortgages. How worried are you about mortgage rates?
Yeah, morning, Sophie. I am concerned. We've seen a really rapid ramping up, haven't we, over the last 12 months, with the Bank of England's bank rate having gone up, over 5 percentage points. And the lion's share of that hasn't yet hit people's bank accounts. That's coming through second half of next year into the first part of next year.
It's interesting about the lag, isn't it? Do you think people really understand what's about to come?
Well, I don't think they're fully factored it in yet. I think the media's done a good job, I would say, of alerting people to what's coming down the pipe. But I think until it actually hits your bank account, until you're actually forming those hard choices, what do I cut to make good on the extra mortgage payment? I think we haven't seen the full consequences remotely of that in people's spending patterns.
And what do you think the full consequences will be then?
Well, it'll be a squeeze. So we've got sort of two forces swaying the economy over the next 6 to 12 months. One of which, a positive one, a tailwind, if you like, will be falls in inflation. That process has begun. On the other side, though, Sophie, the headwind, big headwind, is as the cost of living is falling, the cost of borrowing will be rising, and that will squeeze spending in the opposite direction. I'd hoped, last time we spoke, I'd hoped for a recovery in the second half of the year due to the tailwind. I fear the headwind of mortgage rates will trip that up and halt any recovery in its tracks.
And by halting a recovery, what do you mean by that in layman's terms?
Well, I mean, the economy's been pancake-like, flatlining for 18 months, even with the revisions, big revisions to the data last week. But the story of the last 18 months remains intact. That is to say, we have been stuck. Growth is absent. That means it would take only the tiniest of tilt for us to enter recessionary territory.
So that's still a danger, you think, then?
It's definitely still a danger. I would hope not a sharp recession. But could that rise in the cost of borrowing take the legs from beneath an embryonic recovery? I think it could, and that is definitely a risk.
How big a risk do you think a recession is?
Well, I'd say it's an evens bet as things stand. It's by no means baked in the cake. Naturally, the economy has shown surprising resilience. Households have shown surprising resilience over the last 6 to 12 months. I fear, though, that resilience has come courtesy of them drawing upon their savings. And that pool of savings is not a bottomless pit. We know that perhaps a third of households have fewer than £200 in their back pocket for a rainy day. And that doesn't come close to meeting the increased mortgage costs many will face over the next 6 to 12 months. Come the autumn, we're into the autumn now, I would hope that my former colleagues at the bank would cause for pause when it came to the cost of borrowing. And I hope when it came to the government, there is something in the second half of the year, perhaps at the time of the autumn statement, that can give a bit of a giddy-up to growth by investing in both people and in kit and equipment and machines and buildings in a way that provides a firmer underpin to growth into the second half and builds that confidence, Sophie.
I want to talk to you about that investment in a minute, but just to pick up on what you said about your colleagues, your former colleagues at the bank. So you're saying that if you were still, a voting member at the Bank of England, you'd say, let's stop the interest rate rises, the baseline rises.
I'd have stopped a couple of rises ago, in truth. So I think there's enough in the tank already by way of tightening.
So they've overshot, you think? Maybe?
I think there's a risk of overshooting, and I hope there's not a further overshoot. Because I think there's enough tightening in the tank already to take inflation down to the sorts of levels where people stop talking about it. Where you stop asking me questions about it.
My first one was mortgage rates, right? Yeah.
Completely. And it has been the popular narrative now, not just between you and I, but out in the streets for the better part of 12 months.
Just on the Bank of England, do you think in recent years the Bank of England, I know hindsight's an easy thing, but you did warn about it before as well. Do you think the Bank of England printed too much money and that has fueled inflation?
Well, I think it kept on printing money for a bit longer than it needed to. Should have done, I think, with the benefit of hindsight. Although
you did say that.
I did say that. We probably did a little bit too much for a little too long. I make no apologies about the greater swathe of that easing. That was needed, I think, at the time of COVID to protect jobs and to protect households and to protect businesses. But did we persist with that a little longer than we needed to? And step on the brakes, did they? Step on the brakes a little too late, and therefore a little harder now than they needed to. I think that is probably where we find ourselves, regrettably.
You said we. Would you be tempted to go back to the bank? Some people have got you pegged as future governor.
I did 32 years. That's ample. I'm really enjoying. Actually, this goes to the question of, what are the biggest challenges facing the UK economy right now? And actually, they're not interest rates.
You didn't answer that question, just to say.
No, I've done my time. I've done my 32 years. And I loved it. I loved every one of those 32 years. But now I think the challenges don't sit mainly with monetary policy. They sit on what sometimes called the supply side of the economy. Structural reform.
Let's talk about that now, because you mentioned what you'd like to see the government doing. And there's been, with the crumbling concrete crisis, a sudden look at how Britain is doing in terms of our infrastructure, schools, hospitals, railways. Has there been underfunding?
There's been underinvesting in the assets of UK PLC.
And you mean, for example, school buildings and stuff like that?
I would include schools, I would include hospital estate, I would include road and rail. Yeah. The grand sweep of physical infrastructure, and indeed digital infrastructure to an extent as well. We fare poorly when it comes to the amount we save as a country, save as a nation, and the amount we invest as a nation. And that's the main reason why we're seeing these problems, these fragilities in our infrastructure show up, whether it's crumbling schools or congested motorways and railways.
So should they have seen this coming, the government?
Well, it's a collective we. That underinvestment, long predates this government.
Should we have seen it coming?
I think it was foreseeable that if you consistently underinvest as a nation, then the quality of your what's sometimes called capital stock, the stuff we rely on for our everyday lives, the schools our kids go to, the roads that we drive on, the hospitals that we visit, unless you keep on investing in those things, it trips you up over the longer term. And we've invested too little for too long.
So what would you do then if you're in number 10?
I think now is the time for investment. And that needs to be broadly based, not just government, it needs to be businesses as well, playing their part. But often, the lead needs to come from government. And I've made the point, Sophie, that our current fiscal rules get in the way of that. They don't recognise sufficiently the difference between spending money that gets paid out today and spending money that's investing for tomorrow in the schools, in the hospitals, in the roads and the railways and the broadband. I'd much prefer, rather than us fixating on measures of debt, how much we spend, to look instead at how much we invest in those assets.
Do you think Labour gets it? Because Labour have been very cautious when it comes to investment. They obviously don't want to be pegged at the next election as going back to the sort of magic money tree days, as the Conservatives would put it. But at the same time, if you look at public services, if you look at the infrastructure, a lot of people will be saying, we do need to borrow a bit more in order to get this right.
Yeah. I think both sides of the aisle I would say, could afford to look afresh at the fiscal rules that they've committed to ensure that they're making those investments in all the stuff we've been discussing, which we know have a payoff into the medium term. Our current rules box us in to act in a short-termist fashion, and we know that that ultimately hurts growth over the medium term. So would I prefer a bit more ambition politically on the investment side, on the fiscal side? Yes, I would. I live in hope rather than expectation, Sophie, but nothing wrong with hope.
Yeah, you can keep calling for things. Your background's quite interesting. You were born on a Sunderland council estate. You became one of the first non-Oxbridge graduates to join the Bank of England's trainee scheme. You believe in levelling up. You're passionate about education. Has it shaped your perspective?
Yes, from the early, it's why I became an economist. It's why I entered public service. It's why I've remained a public servant over the period. I do see, and you see too, huge opportunity in people and in places all across the UK, opportunity that's too often being lost.
Just finally, falling house prices, good or bad thing?
Well, near term, bad for the economy, because it saps confidence, it erodes wealth, and therefore will chew up spending. But ultimately, we have in this country built far too few houses for far too long, probably for the greater part of 50 years. If we were to build a more appropriate number, one consequence of that would be certainly house prices not rising as fast as in the past relative to people's incomes. And that would be good from a long-term affordability perspective. We've got a big problem among young people in this country. A mental health crisis, financial precarity, and inability to get their foot on the housing ladder. Levels of home ownership among the 30-year-olds are back to levels of a century ago.
Wow.
The only way we will fix that, and problems like that, is one, by growing the incomes of young people. We've suggested how. And two, by building more houses and therefore making them less expensive. So it's part of the problem near term, but part of the solution longer term.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophie.
You know what really struck me after spending the morning with Andy Haldane? Just how frustrated he was. I got the sense that this is a man looking at the state of the economy and feeling infuriated. He wants politicians to listen to him. That's why he's doing interviews like this. I did ask him off camera if he was tempted to go into politics, though, and he said no. Let's bring in our panel, shall we? Nick Ferrari and Butler. Great to have you both on. It feels like the kind of theme of the show, if you like, is kind of crumbling Britain. Am I being unfair? Is Britain crumbling?
I think it's had 13 years of neglect, and so it absolutely is crumbling. And it's, as you say, the situation with the schools is actually really frightening, and it's a manifestation of what has happened under this Tory government. But it is a very scary situation. And, you know, if only we had invested, if only, you know, this government had picked up the reins of the Building Schools for the Future programme and committed to rebuilding and fixing the schools, we wouldn't be in this mess.
I think, I'm trying to remember your list, I think you missed some off, actually, respectfully. We've got water that is possibly at times poisonous to drink. I haven't been near that yet, but let's hope it's been passed by management, as it were. And we've got more than
directly from the rivers.
more than 7.5 million people waiting to get a hospital appointment. I think the list goes further. And then you see a guy like Andy Haldane. What a fascinating interview. Not Andy Haldane not being the governor of the Bank of England is the biggest miss since Serena Wiegman did not take over the England men's team. He is clearly the guy who could get something done. All evidence points to the current governor, being nothing but a clinker. His job is to keep inflation down to 2%. We know it's been double digits. If he was a football manager, he'd have lost the chairman, he'd have lost the team, he'd have lost the woman who makes the tea. That is the reality of Andrew Bailey. Listen to what that man said on your interview, OK? He talks about the time now is investment, both for some central government and for local business. And yet I feel certain that before the year is out, we will have another lift in interest rates. And Sophie Dawn, the reason why I feel this is that I have honestly had listeners call my show and they are in tears. They cannot make the payments. It's as simple as that. And if you stick with the policy and it's taking you nowhere, why the bloody hell do you stick with it?
It is a worry, isn't it? It was interesting him talking there about the number of households who have less than £200 in savings, which I was quite... I mean, that is quite shocking. I mean, honestly, that's, you know, your dishwasher breaks down. Dishwasher, that's the wrong example.
No, but
your oven breaks down.
Yeah, if the dishwasher's gone, the boiler's gone, you're done.
Yeah, well, we used to be like 4 paychecks away from being homeless, and now most households are just 1 paycheck away from being homeless. That is where we are, the situation at the moment. It is crazy. I mean, it's crazy that people are struggling so much when we're supposed to be, you know, sort of one of the richest countries. Why are people struggling? So where's our priorities, I think we've got to ask ourselves.
What I want to ask you about is the difference between Labour and the Conservatives, because it felt to me, like in that interview, Andy Haldane was saying there's not that much difference between either of them when you're talking about investment, when you're talking about the fiscal rules that he thinks is holding Britain back.
Yeah, so, well, I suppose the big difference is we've got somebody in government who's making decisions, and you've got the opposition who can't actually make decisions.
But they're saying that they'll effectively stick to the same envelope, right?
And Andy was, like, really quite clear. He'd like to see more ambition. He'd like to see more talk about investment.
Would you like that?
The water. Of course, I would. And I will be campaigning and fighting for that as a Labour MP, to say we should be talking about investing in our country, in our people. You know, there's nothing wrong with people. If people haven't got money to spend, that destroys our economy and we start going into recession. We need to start investing in people. That's what keeps the economy buoyant. That's what keeps it going.
Everything has a price, though, Dawn. How's that going to be paid for?
Well, there's lots of money that's still gone missing, right? And so when the government says, well, there's no magic money tree, well, they weren't saying that when they gave all their mates £13 billion of fake PPE contracts. They weren't saying that.
You're right, but that money has... You're right, but that money has gone, of course. Now,
well,
I'm not knocking the point.
But it's gone, but there's nothing to say... Rishi, when he was Chancellor, said, don't ask me about that money anymore. You can't ask about that money that's gone missing. Excuse me, that's fraud. Why can't we ask about that money? And we allow them to get away with that, and we shouldn't be allowing them to get away with that.
Well,
because that's money that money can be reinvested back into the economy, back into our waterways. I think we should, you know, take it all.
But to Sophie's point, is there enough of a gap with your policies from now, as Andy Haldane just referenced? Is there enough of a gap, do you think? I don't think there is.
I think it's a slow burn, if you like.
You're being so diplomatic.
I think it's a slow burn. So I think gradually...
It's one of those heat pumps.
I think they're actually quite efficient, aren't they, heat pumps?
I haven't got one. I can't afford it.
We want people to get heat pumps now. They're actually they're the way forward.
We're going to have an awful lot...
what do we say? Awful, something.
and Dawn as the programme goes on. But if Andy Haldane wants politicians to listen to him, at least one was... This is what happened in Westminster earlier today.
Speaker, Andy Haldane, the former Bank of England chief economist, recently said in a Sky News interview that the Bank of England kept on printing money for longer than it needed to. It's clear that central banks across the world have been addicted to cheap money, and this has contributed to inflation across the world. Does the Chancellor agree with me that printing cheap and easy money has not been without consequence, and instead our monetary policy must focus on important growth factors like productivity?
Chancellor.
Well, I do agree with what he says, and all I would say is the Bank of England themselves have said that there were problems with their inflation forecasting. They are learning the lessons from that, and we must support them every step of the way as they bring down inflation.
Well, asking that question there was the Conservative MP, Sophy Ridge, who joins us now from Central Lobby in Parliament. And thanks so much for being with us today. Why did you ask the Chancellor about that?
Well, look, I, for a long time, have felt that QE is something that is seen as a silver bullet by central banks across the world, and clearly it has long-term effects. And to be honest, when I heard what Andy Haldane had said, I thought, actually, I'm just going to put it to the Chancellor. And he, of course, acknowledged what was said, and actually said, you know, the Bank of England will, of course, reflect on. I think he used the word reflect on their inflationary forecasts, which obviously were out of kilter. And frankly, for me, look, fundamentally, this comes down to what is happening on a daily basis for my constituents, how they're feeling, and in terms of how much money they've got in their pockets. And the interesting thing about QE is, while we've had to do it since 2009, since the financial crash, and we had to do it again in COVID because of the extraordinary amounts of expenditure, clearly there are repercussions for that, and inflation is one of the side effects of that.
Andy Haldane also said that now's the time to pause interest rate hikes at the Bank of England because he's worried about people being able to afford their mortgages. Do you think he's right?
Well, look, Andy Haldane can say that as a former Bank of England chief economist. What I would say, and it's a long-held rule about the independence of the Bank of England, and I really do hold that as a sacrosanct rule. I think the Bank of England have to make a judgment based
Can I just jump in? If I may, and I hear this a lot from MPs, and I understand why, you've got to respect the independence of the Bank of England. But is it a bit dangerous if MPs feel they can't criticise the actions of the Bank of England?
Well, it's not about criticising. I mean, I put the question today in Parliament, but in terms of the decision about interest rates, I think that they have the most up-to-date data. They will have to make those judgments. Of course, as interest rates are going up, my constituents are being affected, people all across the country are being affected. But I think the Chancellor actually made a very good point at the end of his answer to me, which is we have to do our utmost to support the Bank of England to make sure that they're getting inflation down, because that is key. The great wealth destroyer at the moment in this country and across the world is inflation, and that is a point that sometimes gets lost in the narrative.
Great to have you on the programme. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thanks.
Still to come on the Politics Hub, it's the battle of the Chancellors, Jeremy Hunt versus Rachel Reeves. Who do voters trust to turn the economy around? The answers might surprise you. We've got Sam Coates taking you through some exclusive polling. That's next.
Bradley Hemmings, who runs Greenwich and Docklands International Festival, got in touch at the start of the year and said it is the 30th commemorative year of the murder of Stephen Lawrence. What do you want to do in response to it? And my initial response was nothing, because it felt like the responsibility of responding to that seismic event in British history was a bit too much for any one person to take on board. But quite quickly, I started talking to some friends, some collaborators, Mojisola Adebayo, Roy Williams, incredible playwrights. And we started thinking, actually, it doesn't have to be connected to or about anything that happened, and actually we can dream and imagine a new future. And so that's what we're doing. So it does take place on a London bus, on a double-decker that moves, travels through South London. And essentially what it is kind of snippets, snatched conversations overheard on a bus. So that thing we all want to do, where we kind of listen into other people's conversations, we're given permission for this time. Some of the characters that get on board the bus are a mother, some boys, some young, recently migrated lovers. And I guess the kind of thinking of it is certainly not in any way, shape or form to kind of imagine the life Stephen would have lived. I can't think of anything kind of more insensitive or crass. But to look at the many, many myriad of black lives that exist within London and their hopes and their dreams and their aspirations. So we've worked very closely with the Stephen Lawrence Day Foundation, Jessica Neal, who's the chief executive there, and she is often in touch with the family. But I guess we're kind of dealing solely with the foundation because we want to make sure that we're in alignment with their aspirations and their dreams. And that we make something that they would be proud of.
Welcome back to the Politics Hub. I've just got a bit of breaking news to bring you now. It's an update from Pembrokeshire Police about a road traffic collision on the A477. Unfortunately, the update is that one person has died, one person in a critical condition in hospital. The statement says that police are in attendance at the road traffic collision that occurred near Pembroke Dock today, Tuesday, September the 5th. The collision involved a car, but also a coach. One person has died. Next of kin has been informed. Also, a number of passengers on the coach taken to hospital with various levels of injuries as well. So that update there from Pembrokeshire Police. We'll bring you more on that if we get it, of course. But to pick up where we left off after the break, we're looking at the economy. What's wrong with the economy and who can fix it? Now, here's Sam, somebody who has been poring over the story of concrete in schools. And I just want you to tell people about the discovery you've made today.
That's right. So bad news for the embattled Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan. She's under fire because of her decision to close schools from other places in Whitehall where they fear she might have basically unleashed a Pandora's box. Now, when she made the decision on schools, she was given options by her officials and picked the most cautious one, effectively closing more schools than she might have done. Education Department proud about this. They said there are good reasons for it. But elsewhere in Whitehall, they're starting to worry that if all public buildings are held to that standard, that could mean lots of disruption, lots of closures. And the particular point that I've learned is that she made the decision about schools unilaterally. She informed the kind of cross-Whitehall committees that coordinate the concrete issue, which has been going on for years, but she didn't get agreement. She didn't consult them. And this has left other bits of Whitehall worrying that they could be sued for what goes wrong in local government, central government, military, prisons, all of that being a big problem that she has effectively unleashed.
Because the concrete's everywhere, effectively.
Exactly. Pockets of the country used it in not just schools, but all sorts of buildings. OK,
really interesting. We'll be following that story, of course, as it develops. Feels like there's a different development on every hour. You've also got a polling for us, haven't you, about the Chancellor and the person who wants to be the Chancellor.
That's right. So we have been tracking Jeremy Hunt and Rachel Reeves ever since Jeremy Hunt became the Chancellor last October. Pretty much until recently, they were level pegging. But now the exclusive polling from YouGov for Sky News actually means that there is clear red water for Rachel Reeves ahead. She is on 21%, and you can see here that Jeremy Hunt is on 14%. Now, if you remember the Labour years, you had when Ed Miliband was in power, you had David Cameron, George Osborne well ahead of Ed Miliband and Ed Balls. So I think actually in Labour HQ they would take this. But look at this; it's quite interesting. It's the one silver lining. The number of don't knows to this question is extraordinarily high. 2/3 of the population can't decide between the two contenders to be Chancellor after the election. So that could be an opportunity for the Conservatives, far bigger than the gap there. But I think I think there's some things to play for. But if you were Labour, you would definitely take that figure at this point.
You'd totally take it, wouldn't you? Particularly, it's the economy. This is the thing that could very well decide the next election. You've been delving a little bit under the bonnet, if you like, right? Looking about why people seem to be going towards Rachel Reeves. What have you found?
That's right. If you actually throw individual issues at people and ask them which party they'd pick, take growth. Now, I think some people might find this result surprising. They would much rather, by a small majority, 24% would go for Labour, 22% for the Conservatives. Traditionally, the Tories have been the party of growth. So even though that is just a small lead for the Labour Party, I think, again, Labour would take that. If we look at the next one, the cost of living. Now, there, Keir Starmer has a big lead. Twice as many people will trust Labour with that than the Conservatives. So that's an issue where people think that he will help more than the Conservatives, because he's not promising to spend vast amounts, so it's not clear that that matches up with his promises. But nevertheless, you take that if you were Labour. And the final one is the one you've been discussing in the programme already, rising prices, inflation. That actually is looking pretty good for the Labour Party as well, 29% to 12%.
You've been smiling, Dawn.
Of course. It's like to be ahead, right? You know, so of course we will take that. I used to have this political joke that if you want to win, you should change your name to Don't Know, because Don't Know is always seem to get more votes than anyone else. But we would absolutely take that as a win. But I think that is a reflection of how people are feeling. You know, people are finding it difficult to get by day in, day out. You know, inflation, prices, people paying their mortgages, people just buying a sandwich. You know, it's really difficult to survive. And so it's reflected in the polls.
I'd like to redo that poll. I'd like to have Rachel Reeves, Jeremy Hunt and Bob the Builder, because I think most people would put their confidence in Bob the Builder with the state of schools that Sam was just exploring. But actually, I think it underscores the point you made earlier, Sophie, when you said to Dawn, is it 64 or 65% are still in play? It was quite a high number, Sam, I can't remember. And I think that speaks to the fact that you and your guys and women, you haven't actually laid out enough policies. So people clearly are turned off, and it's not surprising. They can't afford to go to the supermarket. There's poison coming out of the tap and God knows what else. But your policies are not out there. And I think that speaks to what Sam has just found in that poll. That's why 64% are in play.
Yeah,
surely.
But, I mean, I don't disagree. I think the strategy has to be to move those don't knows into voting for Labour, and people will start to move over.
But what better time can there be?
Once we
Remember
start
the
talking
litany.
about policies.
But remember the list that Sophie started the show with. Everything from we've got the strikes, we've got the problems with crumbling concrete, we've got water. This is the time. Why aren't you guys absolutely yards ahead? Sorry.
Okay, Tom, if you fancy coming on the programme and telling us, he is always there. Still to come on the Politics Hub today.
I know how bad it is, or bad it was for me anyways. It makes me feel very thankful that I'm not there anymore.
We hear from 15-year-old Florrie, who was so unhappy at school it made her ill. She learns online, but should the taxpayer fund her home education? Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub, where each night we're going to be giving you a front row seat on all the political drama of the day. Now, Rishi Sunak has been under pressure from some of his MPs to abandon some of the government's green pledges, including the race to net zero. But today, the Conservative rebels are on the other side, arguing for more onshore wind farms to help green the economy. Got your head around that? Well, let's speak to someone who knows everything there is to know about parliamentary business. Our chief political correspondent, John Craig, joins us from Central Lobby in Parliament. John, how are the rebellions going?
Well, there's been a rebellion on the third reading vote on the energy bill. Now, you talked about the rebels on the other side, the ones who wanted the ban on onshore wind lifted. Well, they caved in. That was led by Alok Sharma, the former COP president. That was they caved in after Michael Gove, the Levelling Up Secretary, produced a written statement saying that in future, I continue to believe that decisions on onshore wind are best made by local representatives who know their areas. Talk about passing the buck. But that persuaded Alok Sharma and others not to press their amendment. But we had, during the course of the debate, you might say more heat than light on an energy bill, but some pretty strong attacks on the bill from the likes of Craig McKinley. Now, he leads a group calling itself the Net Zero Scrutiny Group, and Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at the end of the vote, there were 21, if you count 2 tellers, voting against the bill. The opposition parties did not vote. Voting was 280 to 19 plus 2 tellers. Now, all the other votes, there were 5 votes before that. Government vote was between 305 and 316. So a big drop in the government vote, and that's because of a rebellion led by Craig McKinley, Jacob Rees-Mogg. Let me tell you what Mr. McKinley said during the debate. I despise this bill, he said. He said that he claimed that people could be sent to prison if they didn't follow energy efficiency rules. He said it was a recipe for energy disaster, and he said they were banning this, banning that, and it's not what we should be doing as Conservatives. And Jacob Rees-Mogg talked about costs, regulations, penalties and obstructions. And he said we should keep the people with us. So it was the anti-bill rebels who were making all the noise, whereas those who wanted better environmental controls and development of onshore wind, they caved in the face of a government climb down.
Sounds pretty heated there, John. John Craig there in Central Lobby, bringing us every twist and turn of parliamentary business. Now, let's talk to Nick and Dawn, shall we? I'm interested to know your thoughts when it comes to net zero, about any compromises that might be necessary. Dawn, what's your sort of position?
I think that the failure to invest in green energy has resulted in people paying an enormous amount of money for energy that they don't have to. I think when you talk about wind farms, they actually create more energy than the grid can handle. And so we could be having cheaper energy right now, but the government's lack of investment in the grid means that that's not happening. And I think that's absolutely shocking.
Who wants to open their curtains to a wind turbine?
They're beautiful.
But they're beautiful.
I think they're absolutely.
What, are you a fan of Spaghetti Junction as well and things like that?
I mean, what would you rather anyway? Would you rather?
I'd like having lovely rolling hills. Of course I would. I don't.
But would you like free electricity? Would you like cheaper electricity?
I'd like cheaper. I don't know if I'll ever.
Greener electricity?
Of course, of course.
That's possible if we invest in green energy.
And I understand there are heaps and heaps of jobs, but you have to respect local people. OK, if you genuinely think, and I believe you, if you genuinely think these are things of beauty, fair enough.
Yeah, we've got some in Wembley.
OK, but a lot of people, I would argue, don't think they're things of beauty. If you go to the Kent coast, where I think there's one of the biggest farms, if that's what you call it, it's either Herne Bay or Margate, there's a lot of people who don't.
But we need green energy.
I totally
agree.
agree.
Where are we going to get it from? These are one of the areas that we can get it from.
Yep.
What we have to do is invest in the grid. The government is shutting down some of these wind turbines because they've not invested in the grid. That's where the priority needs to be.
We get it, and I know this is like I'm a broken record. Water. The possibility of tidal power, if you look at something like the Severn in Bristol, is absolutely enormous.
But the government...
And I appreciate that's a long project.
In the last 20 years, the government has failed to invest. They've taken away all the subsidies that would have meant that they would have invested the technologies for that.
But doesn't that track back to how Sophie started the whole show, which is lack of investment in schools, lack of investment in everything else, and lack of investment...
So what has this government been doing for 30 years? What have they been doing with everything?
Should we talk a bit about Labour's Green Plan, which is quite interesting, right? It's a huge... We're talking about investment. This is a huge investment, right, in green energy. Do you think that some people might worry about whether this is the right amount of money to be spending on green energy at a time when, we've been talking about schools, hospitals, for example, other infrastructure spending is being squeezed?
You will get that money back. You'll get that money back through investment, jobs, green energy. All that money will come back into society and the community. It's not a loss leader, it's a winner.
I mean, what's not to like? Jobs, green energy?
What's not to like, Nick?
The turbine outside my bedroom window. I've just said what's not to... And I see you're appropriately dressed. Your green credentials are undone. No,
you've got green glasses.
I have got my... I know. You've got to wear glasses. You may as well make them exotic ones. There's no point doing anything else. Look, of course, and of course everybody wants cheaper. But there is also... I do think, as I think your report, I think John said, one of the MPs, you have to take the people with you. And although I read that a very high percentage of Conservative voters are behind these policies, I don't know, local people suddenly waking up to wind farms, we have to be aware that there will be objections. You have to accept that,
Taking the people with you is to accept that we cannot rely on oil for our energy. We need to invest in green energy. That's how you take people with you. And yes, of course, they're not going to put like wind farms just anywhere, like unless you've got a really big back garden, Nick. I don't know what your back garden
I live in London.
Like.
What do you think?
What do you think? But you know, at the end of the day,
just big enough for me in a sunbed. No, it's big.
You can't have this NIMBYism whenever we need to invest in
but
change.
you must respect local communities. I hear you, and they must have a means by which they can say.
But they do. There has planning permission. There's notices that goes out that people then have to say yes, they agree or disagree. That goes, but you just can't have people saying no all the time.
As John said, that was a lot of hot air just now. Don't you think it was also fudge, this vote?
Well, yes, but the thing is, you know, the rebellions will only rebel if they know they're not really going to win. That's that's the political game that's at play at the moment.
All right, OK, well, we'll see.
It feels like people are moving towards accepting the need for green energy, though. It is quite interesting. We have moved in the last 5-10 years, haven't we?
Absolutely.
It does feel that way.
But we're behind 20 years because we're definitely behind 13 years because the government refused to invest and took away all the subsidies. Otherwise, the technology would have been, the tidal wave technology would have been already there.
But all I would say is, can you point to another country, European country, that is outstripping us at a ridiculous degree? I do think there's a responsibility. And you're right to point to this country. But let's just pause for a second and look elsewhere.
Point to other countries that have got cheaper energy bills than we have.
But I don't know that we're so desperately far.
A lot of wind farms in France, I have to say. I was there. I was quite struck by the number of wind farms.
Did you find them a thing of beauty?
They are a thing of beauty.
Hang on, did you find them a thing of beauty?
I actually don't mind how they look. I'm just saying.
You can't mesmerised by them as you're going around. It's beautiful. I mean, sometimes...
Well, I'll take you around Spaghetti Junction, then you'll get mesmerised going around there.
Now, to move on to another story, an important story, because some children are at home this week, as we've been discussing, because their schools have been closed for safety reasons. But for others, though, online learning away from school is a lifesaver, an escape from what one 15-year-old called a literal hellhole. And since the pandemic, absence rates in schools have been rising, with more than 150,000 children described as severely absent last summer, which means they missed 50% or more of school. Our People and Politics correspondent Nick Martin reports.
How do you feel looking at the school today from the outside?
Well, I know how bad it is, or bad it was for me anyways. It makes me feel very thankful that I'm not there anymore and I don't have to go back.
Florrie says she hated school so much it made her ill, and like 1.7 million other children in England, became persistently absent, missing weeks and weeks of school.
It felt like a huge leap of faith taking her out of school and doing something different. But every morning, we would have tears. I would walk into her bedroom and she'd be hiding in her cupboard.
Some people watching this will be going, come on, you should have put your foot down and sent her to school.
It was an extreme level of unhappiness that encroached in every aspect of Florrie's life. So something had to give somewhere.
This is where I go to school. It's obviously a bit different.
For the last year, Florrie's classroom has been in the family's home office at the bottom of the garden, a new type of school completely online.
I prefer this a lot because it's easier to focus and easier to read everything. Because if you're in a school, you've just got a lot of people talking.
The government says face-to-face education is still the best way to learn, but online providers are being invited to apply for Ofsted accreditation so that they can be properly assessed as a suitable alternative.
Since Florrie joined MVA, her confidence has transformed.
Hugh Viney founded Minerva Virtual Academy just a couple of years ago. They have 500 pupils on the books and parents pay £6,000 per year.
A handful of parents care about results. We don't. We care about children being happy.
What's it about then?
Happiness. Okay. Children being happy in school.
Right. So their parents can spend £6,000 a year.
Yeah.
They could fail a lot, and that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we're very open about that.
Online providers like Minerva Virtual Academy argue the money given to schools from government for each pupil on the roll should be transferable to other providers. The government says the current system doesn't allow this.
Is it right that the public fund education on a company that's only a couple of years old and
Good question.
doesn't really care about results.
Local authorities we've worked with spend tens of thousands on maths tuition for a kid refusing school. Why can't they spend £6,000 a year on a child getting a full schooling experience?
How is it being on your own every day? I mean, I don't really mind it. Yeah. And I still see you guys.
Online providers are now taking advantage of an education system still trying to recover post-pandemic, with potentially thousands of children wanting to move from a system far from perfect to one that some say is far from proven. Nick Martin, Sky News.
A really important report there from Nick Martin. We're going to have lots from Nick on the Politics Hub as he travels the country, talks to people and focuses on some of the stories that don't get enough attention always here in Westminster. Now, still to come on the Politics Hub, Theresa May's official portrait. The former PM is apparently thrilled with it. Just guess how much it cost? £1,000? £5,000? We'll bring you the answer next.
The pound has rallied. Moderation, interest rates peaking.
And up at 6%.
The highest for 14 years.
Will that be the peak? Will it be a little bit lower?
It's closer to a potential crash.
So many words, so many meanings. But what do they mean for you and your finances? Stay up to date on Sky News.
They have breached the road. There is a lot of gas being fired all around us. शांति से इनको समझाओ वरना ये हम लोग It is an absolute carnival kind of atmosphere out here for Prime Minister Modi's decisive victory. These students are defying the prohibitory orders and now they're going to be arrested. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. The roads have been inundated. The only way out is to get people by boat. What is feared that over 200 people might have died because of these landslides. This on any given day would have been bustling with people, but today it's absolutely deserted. This is one of the most sensitive areas of northeast Delhi where there's been clashes. I'm Neville Lazarus and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. This, I'll admit, is the part of the show I've been most looking forward to. We started the programme teasing this arm. Whose is it? Well, if you guessed Theresa May, congratulations, 10 points, pour yourself a glass of wine, because incredibly, this is part of the former Prime Minister's official portrait in Parliament. I'm going to tell you how much it cost in a second, but first, we've been collecting some of the worst examples of public art. See how many you can recognise. Let's bring in Nick and Dawn. That last one was Melania Trump. I can't actually believe that.
Oh, really?
My favourite is Ronaldo.
Yeah, shocking. Madeira Airport, isn't it? His hometown, his home city. Absolutely
Just extraordinary.
It's so funny.
It is funny. You know he'd have hated it as well.
Totally.
Come on then, how much did it cost?
It cost £28,000.
Well, look, I'm prepared to start a fund now. Could you give me a tenner and I'll put... Because didn't we miss an opportunity? Didn't she need to be painted running through a field of wheat? Now, surely it was...
What about the dance?
Yeah, isn't that what we need to... Or the dance?
Yeah, that would have been better, to be honest. I mean, I'm glad she likes it, because I don't think it's that great.
No, it's not.
28,000, one of my kids in Brent would have, loved that gig.
Yeah, she's a better... Well, how can I know oil painting? But I think it is a very unfortunate depiction, as were all the others. I didn't get all of them. Who else did we have? We had the North Korean leader at some point.
Yeah, that was a good one, wasn't it?
And the late
Andy
Queen...
Murray.
Oh,
was
yeah,
that his
Andy
mum
Murray.
who was next to him then?
I think it was Andy Murray.
Did Billy Bremner pop up at some point? The Leeds football player? I'm completely lost.
If you had 28 grand, what would you spend it on then?
Well,
Picture of yourself? Or?
Definitely wouldn't spend it on a painting like that, to be honest. I do think we have to
would
look at the
paint
money
it.
that we waste as well in the cost of living crisis. I'm sorry to say this, but £28,000 on a painting in the cost of living crisis.
I would take it to the finest model makers in the country. I would have a wind turbine, life-size, and put it outside the window of this young lady in Wembley.
I think they...
Don't worry, I'm working on it.
A few in Wembley.
You open the
curtains.
We don't have £28,000 in front of you, but we did try and make a very important portrait of you.
Oh, really?
So we can have a quick look at using an app. There you go.
Okay.
What do you reckon?
Well, I look even older and more debauched than normal. You look stunning.
That's not bad.
Yeah, you look, I'll tell you that.
It
I look
cost 28,000, didn't it?
Just for free. There you go.
Just for free.
I look like the love child of Cristiano Ronaldo and Theresa May. That's exactly pretty much what I look like. With having water thrown over my jacket.
I think Dawn's come out of it.
Dawn looks sensational.
I'll be honest.
Well, she does
I'll
anyway.
be honest.
So, yeah, there's no problem.
That's true.
I don't hate that. That's all right.
That's all right. Public art does have some value, though, doesn't it? Right? It's the statues that we make, the people that we choose to have more memorialised.
Oh, yeah, but I think it's also important that we understand the history of that as well. I mean, it is important that Theresa May is more... She was Prime Minister of our country, but, you know, there are some statues that needs that explanation and probably needs to be put in a museum.
Well, let's
rather than memorialising them.
Well, let's refer back to your earlier report about education. Surely great museums, great galleries are all about educating our children, as we saw with your reporter there, Nick, there, and that is why it is so important. So all jokes aside, the fact that coach trips do go up to the various museums, they do go to the art galleries, sometimes children are forced to have to take art, is maybe not a bad thing, as long as it's not that me.
Thank you both very much. Really lively panel. I knew it was going to be a good panel tonight, but that is it for this evening's Politics Hub. If you scan the QR code, you can catch up with all the latest on the Hub throughout the day. Good night. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow night.